All right. Thank you again, everyone. I'm going to get a little sip of water. This morning, what I wanted to do is go back to a book that we had used in practitioner class. For those on YouTube, I'm holding it up. The title of the book is The Principles of Healing, and the author's name is H.B., the initials H.B., and the last name is Jeffrey. It is published by an organization out of Fort Worth, Texas, called the Christ Truth League, and I believe Mr. Jeffrey founded it some time ago. As far as I can tell, they're still organized, they're still in operation. They have a Facebook page. I haven't visited it, but I found it when I Googled them last night. Now, to give you a little bit of background on Jeffrey and why this book is so important, as I said, we used it in our third year class, our practitioner training class, because it is a very, very clear textbook, if you will, on this concept of spiritual healing. Now, Mr. Jeffrey, his background was Christian, and he wrote from a position that at many times it seems like he's coming from a very orthodox or fundamentalist Christian perspective. And then suddenly he will kind of switch gears into a more mystical interpretation. And what I think is so wonderful about this is that this idea that there's a principle of healing that we can communicate with, that we can make contact with, is a universal idea. Dr. Frederick Bales tells us that if anyone has ever been healed through prayer, regardless of their denomination or particular theological beliefs, but if anyone has been healed by prayer, it is because they have made contact with a healing presence. In fact, if anyone has been healed by any modality, they have somehow made contact with this healing presence. He goes on in his book to say whether it be by an internist, by a chiropractor, by an osteopath, by a homeopath, it doesn't matter. That there are many ways, there are many approaches that can lead us to this experience of that healing presence. Joseph Campbell, in his work on mythology, steps back from the intricate details of the myths just long enough to find the common threads through them. Now, I want to make sure that I explain here that when I talk about myth, I don't mean a lie. I don't mean a fabrication. In the dictionary, mythology or myth has two different definitions. One is something that is made up, something that is fabricated, and that is the one that in our culture is popularly used. If we don't like something, we say, well, that's just a myth. That's just a myth. We dismiss it as being false or fabricated or made up. But mythology has another interpretations, and a myth is a story, a teaching story. That, as Joseph Campbell will tell us, it's a metaphor. It is the very thing that it is trying to express. And the myths are trying to express the same fundamental truth. So if you step back far enough away from the, as he calls it, the costumes and the color of the culture, we will find that the myths of different people, the creation myths, the fire myths, the myth of the origin of food, these very, very important stories that actually carry the value system of the culture. The myths that people believe in represent their deepest value system. And Campbell tells us if we step far enough away, we see that the same ideas are trying to surface around the globe kind of simultaneously within people that really didn't even have communication with one another. So for example, if we look at the original people on the North American continent, and we look at their mythology about food, and we look at the original peoples in the South Sea Islands, we find that they have similar mythologies about food, not just being a gift from the gods, but the gods themselves have taken the form of the food. Right? almost kind of the idea of communion in Christianity. The God itself has taken the very form of the food that the people need to survive. So Campbell tells us if we step back far enough, and in the color and the costume, as I say, in the Plains Indians, the mythology is white buffalo calf woman. So the deity took on the form of a spiritual being who took the form of the buffalo. In the Algonquian Indians, it was a spiritual being who took on the form of the corn, which was the primary food source. And in the South Seas, it was a spiritual being who first appeared as a human and then took on the form of the coconut tree. And all of these myths are trying to point us in the same direction. Carl Jung, if you haven't read it, Carl Jung's work, Man and His Symbols, he kind of goes into his ideas of the collective unconscious, that we human beings of different places and different times of different cultures, that the symbolism in our dreams is very similar, and it is interpreted with similar meanings. So the idea then that healing through spiritual means or non-physical means, however you want to think of it, this is an idea that has existed in many times, in many places, in many cultures. So it's like the idea of the relationship between humanity and its food source. It's something that's there, that's bubbling up, that people have had experiences with this for a very, very long time. I know I've mentioned this before, but it just kind of really brings home the whole point to me, in that there was a newsman, or I don't know if he was a newsman, but this man was from the Philippines, and he brought a newsman back to his native village. Now, his mother was a shaman in what we would call today a Stone Age tribe. These people living in the rainforest of the jungle in very primitive means. So not inferior people, not stupid people, but people who were living without the benefit, or perhaps with the benefit of not having the all of the electronics and the things that we have in our modern society. They lived in huts. They lived off the land. And she was the healer of the tribe. She was a very old woman. She was the healer of the tribe. And she had a short stick. It might have been about 18 inches long and maybe an inch in diameter, a little tree limb that had been cut and kind of the stubs whittled down off of it. So it was kind of a round stick about 18 inches long. If you took a piece of broom handle and cut about 18 inches long, you have the idea. And the people in the community who were ill would come to her, and she would talk to them a little bit, and she would do some chanting, and then she would go around the person, and she would go into her chant, and she would take this stick and hold it almost like a pool cue. And if the person said they had a pain in their shoulder, she would go behind them, and she would take that stick, and she would tap it into the shoulder, like you were shooting a cue ball. She was shooting it into their shoulder, and it didn't matter what their ailment was. She would kind of go to whatever part of the body was distressed, and she would do that. And the newsman who had went along to do this interview asked her, if there was some kind of magic in the stick, and that the magic was producing the healing. And she laughed. She actually laughed at him. And to her, that was a funny idea, that there would be magic in the stick. Excuse me. And she said, no. She said, no, don't be silly. The stick doesn't do the healing. It's the intention. It's the intention that does the healing. So here was this lady, at least as portrayed on the TV show, who did not have the benefit of modern education, did not have the knowledge of modern medicine, did not have the tools that we have available to us in our doctors and our hospitals. But what she had was a principle that people have held on to for many, many years, that it is the intention. Right? It is done unto us according to our belief. We have intention, and something acts upon that intention, and something makes it so. So Jeffrey starts off his book And he goes into a little bit of explanation of kind of some of the history of healing and the history of humanity's ideas about where disease comes from and how disease could be cured through spiritual means. Excuse me. And what he tells us is that some of the earliest ideas that people had was that disease is something that came upon them, that they brought it upon themselves, if you will, through sin, through disobeying the God or the gods in their particular religion or their particular theology. That somehow they had done something that was against the will of God, and they were made ill, or they were caused to be ill because of this. And that what they needed to do in order to be well again, because they considered themselves not worthy to make the approach to God themselves. I'm going to come back to that. Remember that. They considered themselves not worthy to make the approach to God themselves. They went to the high priest or the shaman or whatever the society believed in. And even the high priest, if the high priest felt that he had a blemish on his consciousness or his body, remember in the Hebrew tradition, Jeffries tells us that if the high priest even had a blemish somewhere on his body, he would not go into the Holy of Holies, or the inner sanctum of the tabernacle, the place where the very presence of God was believed to be. That he couldn't go in there because he wasn't clean. He wasn't worthy of that. So what people believed is that they had to somehow get somebody else to go and make an intercession, to do something, to perform a ritual for them, so that the effect, which was the illness, would go away, because somehow the cause, the sin that they had committed, the unworthiness that they had committed, was going to be reconciled. It was going to be made up. And these are the ideas of atonement, the ideas of sacrifice, and all of these different ways that people had of trying to get themselves back right, if you will, get themselves back into the experience of the presence, the experience of the health. Now I want you to consider from this point of view then that what disease is, dis-ease is lack of ease, that health is considered to be the normal, natural state. Health is the way it's supposed to be. And when something occurs that is not the way it is supposed to be, then people feel that that is disease. And when something occurs that is not the way it is supposed to be, they start to think, well, I've done something to get myself afoul of the gods, and now I need to do something to get myself back into the good graces of the God. Right? And if you look at the book of Job, if you go back and read the book of Job in the Old Testament, the book of Job is sarcasm. The book of Job is poking fun at that idea. Job is inflicted with all of these different ailments, and allegedly because Satan made a bet with God. And for those who believe that the devil is behind all this stuff, they like to quote Job a lot because it mentions Satan. But the Satan in the book of Job is not the concept of the devil as we have it today. That concept of the devil arose in what's called the intertestamental times between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Very, very heavily influenced by Persian religion, and then later on it was very heavily influenced by thoughts from Islam of what Satan is and all these ideas. But if you stop and look at the book of Job, it starts off with Satan is in heaven with God having a conversation. And so it's not to be taken literally. But the whole book is pointing out these ideas of all these people who are coming up with all of these explanations as to why Job is having all this trouble heaped upon him. You know, he did this, he did that, he did the other thing, and God is punishing him, and God is testing him, and all of this that is represented by this idea that if we are sick, if things are not as they ought to be, whether it be in our physical health, our mental health, our relationships, our finances, our activities and work, all those things encompass what I'm talking about in healing. And the book of Job was sarcasm, making fun of that, because in the very end what happened was Job says, you know I'm good, you made me yourself. You know I'm good, you made me yourself. And then his troubles went away. Very important, very important. See, that realization that he had didn't come to him through the actions of a high priest or a shaman or a ritual or a sacrifice. They came to him through consciousness. Through consciousness. Through his conscious awareness that he was already one with the very presence and the very love of God. So what Jeffries goes on to tell us as we go into his book, what he starts to tell us, and by the way, everything I just told you about the book of Job is not in Jeffries' book. I believe that came from Rocco Errico. But as Jeffrey goes into the book, he says it is this aligning of consciousness with the perfect consciousness of God. That is what the healing is all about. That is what causes the healing. That if we go to the New Testament and we look at the healing miracles of Jesus, that it was his very presence that did the healing, his very consciousness that did the healing. Remember, there's actually a story of a woman who couldn't get close to him, so she touched the hem on his garment and she was healed. He didn't have to say anything. He didn't have to know anything. He knew what she did. Remember, it turns out he says to her, he talks to her. But just being there, just being in this presence. Now, remember, to our way of thinking, that what the Christ represents to us is the presence of the divine within each and every one of us. And one who is fully aware, or perhaps as fully aware as we might be able to be in this place on earth. And this is what the person Jesus represented. An individual who was so in touch, so in tune with his oneness with God, that he could mystically say, I and the Father are one. When you're looking at me, you're looking at the Father. Now, I realize that in our traditional Orthodox ways of thinking, Jesus has become a great exception. That he was the very Son of God, and he could say that because he was the Son of God. But in the mystical experience, in the mystical way of thinking, that is truly each of our destiny, each and every one of us. The book of Revelation is about someone named John. Remember, the book of Revelation is a vision. It's a mystical vision. It goes beyond words' ability to describe. But John is trying to describe his experience of the presence of the divine. And it's very interesting to me that is the last book in the way that the Bible was assembled. And Genesis is the first, because we begin with human beings coexisting with God, walking in the cool of the evening in the garden. But they still had an idea of separation. That was the interesting thing. They still believed in an idea of separation. And the Bible closes with the book of Revelation, which is the complete awareness of the unity of the presence of the divine. This idea of I and the Father are one, you and I are one, is not something that is just entirely belongs to Christianity. You will find that mystics of many traditions, in no particular tradition, have this experience of oneness, this experience of unity with all of life, with the presence, with something that's ineffable, that they can't describe. If you're interested in that, check out Richard Maurice Buck's B-U-C-K-E book, Cosmic Consciousness. But what Jeffries is telling us is that the person Jesus had this consciousness, had this consciousness of unity, had this idea of oneness so complete in his being that an idea of separation did not exist. And it was this consciousness of unity that was the healing power, that was the cause of the miracles that were performed. If you consider the healing miracles of the New Testament, Jesus didn't do diagnostics. He didn't sit down with somebody and say, well, let's look at, how old are you, and how much do you weigh, and what's your blood pressure, and tell me, did anybody in your family have heart disease or diabetes? All those kind of things. Tell me about your diet. Tell me about your exercise. He didn't go into any of that. He didn't go into any of that with people. Remember, he said to the paralyzed man, just pick up your cot and go. Just pick up your cot and leave. Because, and this is what is important, because the mind of the divine doesn't see anything to heal. It doesn't know anything other than itself. And this Jeffries gives us as one of the principles of healing. He who heals best is the one who sees nothing to heal. Nothing to heal. Now, as I said at the beginning, Mr. Jeffrey, when he writes his book, he is coming from a very, very traditional Christian perspective. And then he says, the mind of God knows no evil. I want you to think about that for a moment. The mind of God knows no evil. It knows no sin. It knows no sickness. It knows no distortion. It only knows itself. It only knows its own perfection. It couldn't possibly see that there was something that needed healing. It couldn't possibly see that its creation has sinned. It couldn't possibly see that its creation needed to be punished or to be taught a lesson. It only knows its own perfection. And it is this consciousness that was epitomized in the person Jesus. It is this consciousness that is so aligned with and attuned with that perfection that already exists, that is what heals. That is what the healing consciousness is about. So Jeffries goes on to tell us, that in the beginning, of course, people didn't know a lot about physics and chemistry and science, and they didn't know a lot about how matter acts and interacts, and their belief in sickness was a spiritual idea, and it was associated with sin and unworthiness, and its belief in healing was somehow doing something or getting someone to do something for you because you weren't worthy, that they would do something for you to somehow set things right with God. But then over time, what happened is we as human beings came to learn more about modern medicine. We came to learn more about how matter acts and interacts. And nothing at all wrong with that. It is all good. It's a beautiful expression of an inquiry into how this universe of God's works and how things are put together. But what had happened is over time is our society's reliance on spiritual methods of healing diminished, and our reliance on physical methods, material methods, medicine, surgery, and those kind of things, it increased. It increased. As Raymond Charles Barker puts it, he says, what happened is we started to develop more faith in our checkbook than we did in our ability to interact with the law of mind that creates according to our belief. So we had this idea then that took over and prevailed for hundreds of years now, probably, I guess probably starting in the 1600s or so, we really got into the modern age of science as we know it today. And this idea came about, whereas healing was all just simply, an organic thing. Disease was an organic thing. That there was nothing more to it than the action and reaction and interaction of chemicals and cells and all of that. And this whole business of consciousness and thinking and the psyche and all of that seemed to be kind of pushed to the side. In fact, psychology became a separate study unto itself. And today people will argue whether psychology is even a quote, a real science or not, or if it's just more of a philosophy. But psychology, which the very word means the study of the soul, psychology got relegated off to the side while the body was treated as some type of a machine that breaks down and needs to be repaired, and all of this is done on purely a physical level. And there's no doubt that the body is a chemical organism, and that working with drugs and surgery and all of these kinds of things can result in a healing. There's absolutely no doubt about that, and there's no reason to discredit any of that. Ernest Holmes said it doesn't matter what gives you relief. It's what you believe in. What gives you relief? If it's a pill or a prayer, if it gives you relief, it's all good. We bless it all. But the point is that what has been happening is we moved away from our reliance on spiritual means, and we moved more into our reliance on material means. Now, an interesting sidebar here, there's a book, it's called Alternate Religion and American Medicine, or something very similar. And the author of the book talks about how alternate religions spread through alternate healing practices. And here's what happened. If you look at the United States of America in the early 1800s, the people who were the doctors were also the clergy, because they were the best educated minds. These were people who had the benefit of going off to a church-sponsored university. And they were trained not only in theology and ministry, but they were trained in medicine as well. So when people went to the doctor in those days, they went to their clergyman. And if their doctor could not afford them a healing, the doctor said, well, there's just nothing we can do about this. People are people. You get told that, and you say, well, I'm going to go get a new doctor. I'm going to go find a new doctor. I'm going to get a second opinion about this. That's just his opinion. So what would happen is, because the doctors in medicine, as we have come to understand it, as primitive as it was in those days, they were also the clergy, that if somebody wanted to go get a second opinion, they had to go get a different religion as well. They went out and they were exposed to different religious ideas as well. Now this, I know you've all heard the saying, well, that's just an old wives' tale. That's just an old wives' tale. That came about because as Christianity came into the rural areas in Europe, where there had been traditional practitioners of medicine, of the shamanistic type that we talked about, the native healers, if people went to them, people would be taught the old religion, which was called the pagan religion, and it is kind of used in a demeaning manner. But pagan just meant the country people, the religion of the country people, right? So what happened is if people went to the old healers in order to continue with their traditional forms of healing, they also got exposed to the traditional ideas of that native spirituality. And the establishment that was coming along, the establishment of Christianity, didn't like that. So what they did was they said, don't listen to those people. That's just an old wives' tale. And that was the establishment's way of dismissing the religion of the native people. So another thing that was going on is, and I haven't personally researched this, I've read it at a couple of places, but I haven't personally researched it. I haven't spent days going and looking at books to verify it. But I will I will mention it in case anyone wants to do that, is that when Christianity first started to evolve, healings continued to take place, healings in the form of the healings that Jesus performed. But as Christianity evolved, what happened is that the priests who were able to have the healings were not necessarily the highest authorities, in the echelon of the organization. They weren't the bishops and the cardinals and those sorts of things. They might have just been lowly monks in a parish church somewhere. And there was a question in the people's minds. Remember, the old idea was, well, the high priest couldn't go in the temple if he or she had a blemish, even, because they weren't worthy to go in there, and they couldn't go in there and effect a healing for anybody else. And the mindset of the people was, well, if this lowly monk can have miracles worked through his activity, through his spiritual consciousness, and this very exalted bishop can't, well then, maybe the bishop isn't as spiritual as he needs to be. That's where people's minds were going, according to what I read. And again, I haven't personally gone in and dug to verify it, but I've read that in several different places. So the result of that, allegedly, is that the hierarchy then started to discourage spiritual healings in the church. They started to, come down upon those who had healing ministries and kind of put an end to that. So over time, the reliance on spiritual healing, and remember, the reliance on spiritual healing was based on an idea that sickness, whether it be of body, mind, or affairs, it was a condition that was not the normal condition, that came about because somehow this person, somehow the individual, had gotten on the wrong side of God. And what they needed was somebody else to go in and do the spiritual work for them. And then we have this idea come along that now it's all just chemistry, it's all just physics, and we don't need to consider the psychology, how the soul works. We don't need to have that in there. But what is starting to happen now, what Jeffries brings to our attention, and for those who are reading with us on a Wednesday night Skype group, we're reading Joe Dispenza's book, You Are the Placebo, is the interaction of mind, whatever that means. I would prefer to say consciousness, but the interaction of people's thoughts and people's beliefs on their physical body is something that is there. It can't be denied. Now science has a name for it. They call it the placebo effect, and they tend to dismiss it and say, oh, well, that was just the placebo effect. But it is, in fact, evidence that the mind and the body interact. There's no denying it. They cannot deny it. Herbert Benson wrote an interesting book on asking what the placebo effect is, and raising the question of, if we spent as much time and money studying the placebo effect as we do studying the interaction of drugs, we might be able to come up with a way to heal that doesn't require medicine at all. And then, of course, the problem is, well, who's going to make money off of that? It's the big companies, the big drug companies, that are funding the research into drugs. Who's going to fund the research into how mind works? And of course, that's kind of what we're doing. That's kind of what we're doing on an individual level. So now we're back at a point where this whole idea of the interaction of mind and body is there. It cannot be denied. It is there. But we still don't know how it works. Right? People still don't understand how it works, but it is there. And how much does it work? You'll hear people talk about, well, this drug here, it's a certain percentage more effective than the placebo effect. And Benson raises the question in his work, well, really? How do you know that? How did you measure it? How can you be sure how accurate your measurement is? Maybe if we understood the true impact of it, it would be greater. But nevertheless, his point of, who's studying that? Who's looking into it? Who's trying to figure it out? Is a valid one. And of course, if you pick up Jeffrey's book, you'll find that spiritual people have known about this and talked about this for years. Just a side note, Jeffrey first started his work in 1903, which was 16 years before Ernest Holmes published his first book in New Thought. Jeffrey studied with Emma Curtis Hopkins, who was also a teacher of Ernest Holmes, and Jeffrey went over to England and worked with Thomas Troward. So he was in the company of some of the very first prominent teachers of New Thought in this modern era, this resurgent of New Thought. Eric Butterworth tells us there's nothing new in New Thought. These ideas have been around for thousands of years, but as I said, they've kind of been suppressed as both the establishment looked down upon healing by natural native religions as being superstition, and then turned and put their faith in material medicine as opposed to spiritual medicine. So Jeffries goes on to tell us, and he says, now if you stop and think about this, what heals is the consciousness. It is the consciousness of the oneness. It is the consciousness that sees nothing that requires healing. And as I said before, his statement, that God knows no evil, is kind of something to really think about if you're coming at it from a traditional point of view, because if God sees no evil, then there can't be a hell. Have no reason to send people to hell. So it starts, the idea starts to unravel some of the old ways of thinking. And what we come to then is this idea that what we, you and I, if we want to heal ourselves or if we want to heal another, what we need to do is we need to find a way to move out of this world of appearances. And we need to move ourselves beyond all of that, beyond in terms of, as the Upanishad says, there's something that was there before words came to be. There was something that was there before the human brain came into existence. There was some consciousness, some isness, some I amness that was just there. And what we are doing as healers, as spiritual healers, is we are turning completely away from the appearances, right? Another principle of healing. Judge not by appearances, but judge by the righteous judgment. Which means we are bringing ourselves into a consciousness that also sees nothing to heal, that releases all judgment, that refuses to get caught up in the drama of human events that serve only to distract us from the most important work that we can ever do, which is to eliminate from our consciousness everything that tells us about separation. Now here, back to the beginning, and here is a most important point to consider. The idea at the beginning was that sickness and disease came about as a result of some sin or some transgression against God. And the person who was sick was not worthy of approaching God directly for a healing. The shame, whatever it might be, they couldn't do it themselves. It could also be that the people who set up the organization of the religion told them that, you need to come to me and bring your doves and your money, and we'll get this taken care of for you. But they felt that they couldn't make that approach themselves. And they felt that they had to go to a high priest who could not make the approach himself if he had even a blemish on his body or on his mind or on his thoughts. And what we have to consider is that if we are waiting to find someone who is perfect to go and do the work for us, even if they could do the work for us, if we are waiting to find someone who is perfect to go and do the work for us, we will never find them. Because we are all human. We all have doubts. We all have times of wonder. And what we need to come to is a realization that the only thing that is ever going to heal, the only thing that is ever going to change our consciousness is our exposure to the presence of the divine. And no one can do that for us. No one can sprinkle holy water on us. No one can put smoke or incense or smudge around us. No one can chant for us or lay hands on us. The only place that that will occur is within our own consciousness. So we have to completely get rid of the idea of unworthiness that has kept us from making the approach ourselves. Right? And in some cases, I honestly believe that people turn to the material healing because it's a lot easier than doing the spiritual work. And we have to recognize that it is our responsibility and our accountability that we are the ones who must bring ourselves just as we are into the conscious awareness of the presence of God. And that is what will do the healing in our lives. Emmett Fox tells us that the only thing that truly changes consciousness is prayer. And he was talking about scientific prayer, as we would call it, spiritual mind treatment. Because in the act of praying, and because of the act of praying, we are setting into motion a power that reveals to us more and more the presence of the divine. So our spiritual practice then, our life, then is about this conscious union, this conscious communion with the presence of God. That this is the way that we get there. We move beyond the appearances. We move into the consciousness of unity, and we do that through our spiritual practice. We do that by refusing to allow ourselves to be caught up in the drama that goes on around us. When we were studying some books on Zen Buddhism, one of the books said, no matter what comes up, just say, perhaps, perhaps. Don't get caught up in it. Perhaps. Just let it go. All right? Keep your eye, your single-minded eye, keep your eye on the awareness of the presence of God. And then that is what our day is about. The last thing that Jeffrey tells us, and it ties this all together, is that the physical healing of whatever it may be, disease or broken bone, whatever, the physical healing is the result of attainment. That the healing is not the end goal. The healing is a side effect of attaining the consciousness of the awareness of the presence of God. That is the goal. The healing comes because we have attained it. So what we want to do then, as we consider what Jeffries is telling us, is that there is a power in the universe that has created everything out of itself. If it could bring into existence a universe and galaxies and stars and black holes and planets and plants and animals of every kind, simply by its intention, simply by declaring, let it be, then there's nothing that it cannot do in terms of restoring our physical bodies to health. Nothing. It has created these bodies entirely by its own intention. 2 cells became 4 and so on. The bodies that we have today are not the bodies that we had 2 years ago. It knows how to take care of these bodies because the only image that it has is the image of perfection. It does not know disease. It does not know pain. It does not know suffering. It only knows its own perfection. Through our daily meditation, through our daily spiritual mind treatment, And through consciously watching and observing our thoughts all of the time, and when we are faced with something that we have just bought into that we know we shouldn't have, to say cancel and replace. Cancel and replace. I don't want to believe that. I let that go. What I do believe is that there's only one life, and it is God, and it is perfect. And it demonstrates itself in me, as me, and through me as perfect health right here and right now. So the entry point of Jeffrey's book, God is abstract. We cannot get our minds around this thing called God. So we have to have entry points. And Jeffrey's entry point is physical healing, because people cannot deny it. They cannot argue with it. Dr. Holmes tells us when you have the demonstration, you cannot deny that there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. So he took us through the door, on this pathway to God with physical healing. But the place that he got is the place where all mystics get, is the experience of unity with the divine. We can start through physical healing, we can start through love, we can start through service, we can start through study and knowledge. All roads up the mountain that lead to the top, and once we get to the top, the experience of the presence of the divine, how we got there doesn't matter. But because we all have physical bodies, because we all have aches and pains, it is a wonderful place for us to practice, to make our lives our spiritual laboratory, to consciously cooperate with the presence of God. So I invite you this week, choose something. Choose something that you would like to see changed in your life. And think about it, and then forget about it. And instead turn your attention entirely to the perfection that God is. Declare that that perfection is unfolding in, as, and through you right here and right now, and keep your mind stayed on God. If ever you find your mind wandering, just simply bring it back and say, God is all there is. And a show comes on the TV, and the news breaks in and tells you what terror is going on, terrible things are going on in the world, and you say, appearances. God is all there is. Allow your consciousness to come into union with the only presence and power there is. And let that be the healing of everything in your life that is not the way it should be. You are an individualized expression of God's perfection. If there are any areas of your life where you are not experiencing that, it is because there's a belief in separation. Don't try to dig up that belief. Don't try to face it down. Just turn your back away from it, because it is nothing pretending to be something. And instead turn your attention to the conscious union of the presence of the divine, and that will dissolve every idea of separation that exists within you and within all consciousness. And in this way you will be a light unto the world. And so it is.